All right, so we're here to learn how to solve absolute value equations, and there's actually not that difficult of a process to solve absolute value equations. There's a few steps that you need to know, but once you kind of get the hang of it, it's really not too bad. So for example, let's say I have this absolute value equation here. If the absolute value of x plus 1 minus 5 is equal to 2. Now, whenever we solve an absolute value equation or inequality, we'll get to those in a little bit, but anytime you're solving an absolute value equation or an inequality, the first thing that you want to do is you want to isolate the absolute value. Okay, you want to isolate the absolute value. All right, we want to get this absolute value completely by itself. So I want this whole absolute value by itself. So what I need to do is I need to get rid of anything that's on that side of the equal sign that's not inside the absolute value. And the only thing that's not inside the absolute value on this side of the equation is that minus 5. So I need to move that minus 5 over. How do I do that? I'm answering my own question. I'm adding 5 to each side, okay? That's how we're moving it over. And then from there, we're going to have the absolute value of x plus 1 is equal to 7. So now we have this absolute value equation of absolute value of x plus 1 is equal to 7. So now we have the absolute value isolated, okay? There's nothing happening on this side of the equation that's not inside that absolute value, all right? So from there, what we need to do is we need to write and solve two equations, okay? Now, I'm going to put a little note here and say there are some special cases. Okay, and I'll get to those in a little bit. But we want to set up our two absolute value equations, because what this absolute value equation right here is saying is what number or numbers are 7 away from negative 1. I know it's plus 1 in here, but we actually use the opposite sign. So what this is saying here is what number or numbers are 7 away from negative 1 on the number line. Okay, and that's why the absolute value always spits out a positive value. It's measuring a distance, and a distance cannot be negative. Okay, so the inside of the absolute value could become 7, because if the absolute value is 7, absolute value 7 is 7, it works. So the inside of x plus 1 could get a 7, because if x plus 1 is 7, the absolute value of 7 is 7. It works. It checks out. So that's going to be one of my equations, okay? Or the inside of the absolute value, x plus 1, well, it could also be negative 7. Because if, say, the inside of this was negative 7, well, the absolute value of negative 7 is 7. And 7 equals 7, so that would work as well. So that's what I mean by write and solve two equations, okay? Notice what was inside the absolute value did not change at all. It is still x plus 1 in both equations. All that happened is I set one up equal to the positive 7, and I set a second one up equal to negative 7. So I changed the sign in the second equation. That's really it. And now we go ahead and we solve each equation using the exact same step. In both of these, I have x plus 1. I want to get rid of that plus 1. So I'm going to subtract 1 from each side. And that's why I'm going to get my two answers. I'm going to get two answers of x equals 6 and x equals negative 8. So these would be our two solutions. So that is just a more straightforward case of solving absolute value equations. And you can always double check these answers by plugging it back into the original equation. Okay, so like for example, let's say I wanted to double check, make sure negative 8 actually worked. I'm going to plug it back in and see if it works. Okay, so let's see if negative 8 works. The absolute value of x, well, I'm saying x is negative 8 plus 1 minus 5. And I want to make sure it's actually equal to 2. Well, negative 8 plus 1 is negative 7. The absolute value of negative 7 is 7. 7 minus 5 is 2. 2 equals 2. It checks out. So negative 8 definitely works. And you could do the exact same thing for 6, and you would see it would work as well. Okay, so that's kind of one example. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make up one that's just a little bit trickier. All right, so let's say for example I had, let's say 2 times the absolute value of x minus 3 plus 7 is equal to, let's say, 15. Okay, now the exact same process, I want to isolate my absolute value expression. Okay, so I want to get only this on one side of the equal sign. So the first thing I should do is I should get rid of this plus 7. Okay, I need to get rid of this plus 7. Well, it's adding 7, so to get rid of it, to move it to the other side, I'm going to subtract 7 from each side. Okay, so I'm going to have 2 times the absolute value of x minus 3 is now equal to 8. Okay, now I have 2 times the absolute value of x minus 3. A common thing, I shouldn't say it's common, but sometimes I see people actually distribute the 2 or whatever this number is into the absolute value, and although it's not technically wrong, that does actually make it just a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to follow through and isolate this absolute value expression. Okay, what that 2 is doing to the absolute value is multiplying it, so I can get rid of it. I can move it to the other side by dividing each side by 2. Because 2 divided by 2 is 1. Alright, so I'm going to have the absolute value of x minus 3 is equal to 4. Okay, and now I have my absolute value expression isolated. It's just the absolute value on one side and just a single number on the other side. So now I can set up my 2 equations. I'm going to set them up over here. Alright, now the inside of the absolute value, x minus 3, could be 4, because the absolute value of 4 is 4. It would work. Or the inside of the absolute value, x minus 3, could spit out a negative 4. Because say x minus 3 is negative 4, the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. 4 equals 4. We're good. Okay? And now we would go ahead and solve each of these. Okay, so I need to go ahead and add 3 to each side. And it's actually going to be the same for both equations because we don't change anything that's inside the absolute value. You never change what's inside the absolute value. And that's going to get us our 2 answers of 7. We're going to have 7 and negative 1. And that's our 2 answers, okay? Now, there are some special cases, and I want to get to those, okay? So, for example, let's say we had something like, let's say the absolute value of 2x plus 1 minus 3 is equal to negative 3. Okay, so we have the absolute value of 2x plus 1 minus 3 is equal to negative 3. I'm still isolating this absolute value the exact same way as every other problem. Okay, the only thing that's not inside the absolute value on this side is the minus 3, so I need to move that over. I'm going to add 3 to each side. So I'm going to add 3 to each side. So I'm now going to get the absolute value of 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. So we got our absolute value isolated. Okay, step 1 done. Now we have to write and set up our 2 equations. So we would set up, well, 2x plus 1 could be 0, or 2x plus 1 could be negative 0. That's not a thing, okay? So this is actually a special case. When we isolate the absolute value and it's equal to 0, we're actually only going to have one equation and one solution. There's only one way to get 0, okay? The absolute value of 0 is 0. That's the only way, okay? So we're actually only going to have one solution. And I would solve this just like I would solve any other equation of this manner, okay? I undo any addition or subtraction first. Undo any addition or subtraction first. So I'm going to have 2x is equal to negative 1. Then I'm going to divide each side by 2. And I get x is equal to negative 1/2. And that would be my solution. So that's one takeaway here, okay? If we isolate the absolute value and it's equal to 0, you're only going to have one solution, okay? Like, for example, If we have like the absolute value is equal to 4, there's two ways we can get that. It could be the absolute value of 4 or the absolute value of negative 4. There's only one way to get 0 out of an absolute value, and that's with the absolute value of 0. That's why there's only going to be one solution, okay? Now there is another case, okay? So there is another case. So let's say I had 2 minus 4 times the absolute value of x minus 5 is equal to 10. Okay, let's say I have this. All right, now I would isolate the absolute value just like I do in any other problem. Okay, I have to undo any addition or subtraction first. Now, quick note, some people are going to try to combine this to a negative 4, and they're going to somehow make this negative 2 times the absolute value of x minus 5. Okay, we cannot do that. This negative 4 is multiplying the absolute value. This 2 is just adding it. Think of order of operations. Multiplication comes first. That's why we cannot combine those two, okay? So what we should do is we should actually get rid of this 2 by subtracting 2 from each side, all right? So what this is going to become now is negative 4 times the absolute value of x minus 5 is equal to 8, all right? Now just one more step, that negative 4 is multiplying the absolute value, so I would divide each side by negative 4. I would divide each side by negative 4, and now I'm going to have the absolute value of x minus 5 is equal to negative 2. And here is where we need to really think about this. An absolute value can only spit out a positive answer, okay? What this is saying is the absolute value of some number x minus 5 is going to become negative 2. There is no way an absolute value can ever spit out a negative number. There's no number that will ever let that happen, okay? So if we ever get an absolute value equal to a negative number, once we isolate the absolute value, so I isolated it, it's only the absolute value on the left side of the equation, and it's equal to a negative number, it is no solution. It is not possible, okay? There is no number in our real number system that when plugged in for x is going to spit out a negative 2, okay? So whenever we get an absolute value equal to a negative number, I should just write out negative, shouldn't I? Whenever we get an absolute value equal to a negative, there's an I there, number, it is automatically no solution, okay? So that's solving absolute value equations. The next video, we'll be talking about solving absolute value inequalities. Very similar process, just a little bit different.